Integration begins way before you trip, because once you start thinking about tripping, it's in your mind, and you're wondering, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? What do I work on? How do I get ready? What do I want out of it? What don't I want out of it? So the integration part, I think, also begins when you start to think about tripping. How do you want to apply whatever it is that you experience?
Welcome to Modern Psychedelics, where we explore the transformations made possible through intentional engagement with psychedelics. This podcast will help you integrate high consciousness living into the everyday and deepen the work ignited by altered states. You can expect balanced and grounded conversations around therapeutic, ceremonial, and recreational containers. My name is Lana Pribic, your host and guide. I am a 3-time certified professional life coach, and I work with people who want to integrate higher levels of consciousness into their daily lives so they can feel more peace, fulfillment, and connection. After all, our time here on Earth is so brief, so let's make sure we're really living. The song you hear is called Lost Horizon by Peace Sign. All right, let's journey. I am so freaking happy that it's finally spring. I'm actually coming out of a really challenging month myself, and I've really been taking this as an opportunity to reflect on how just my ability and my capacity to navigate these messy times has evolved over time. And honestly, it's thanks to both psychedelics and coaching. And as a token of gratitude, I am offering $500 off of my one-on-one coaching program for this week only. So that means in order to take advantage of this special offer, all you have to do is apply for my coaching program before April 6th, 2024. The short application can be found at modernpsychedelics.net/apply. I also have it linked for you in the show notes of this episode, so go ahead and click that link. If you are on your journey with psychedelics, coaching is the perfect modality to pair with it. As a psychedelics-informed life coach, I facilitate the same conversation that happens in the psychedelic experience. This allows you to fully open up to change and transformation and really become empowered in your own life and turn those insights into actions. So to share a little bit about the impact of coaching with you, the Global Coaching Client Study from the International Coaching Federation shows most clients who work with a professional coach report improved work performance, more growth and opportunities, greater self-confidence, enhanced relationships, more effective communication skills, better work and life balance, and an improvement in wellness. According to the same study, 99% of people who were polled said they were somewhat or very satisfied with the overall coaching experience. And I see similar results amongst my clients every week. And that's because in my coaching container, we address your inhibitions and your limiting beliefs and the things that are holding you back from a deep subconscious and energetic level. That's why we see so many improvements in all areas of our life from coaching. So along with being psychedelics informed, my style is process oriented. In this outcome obsessed world, our default mode is to live for the destination or the end result. But I have come to understand that the gifts are in the journey. The juice is in the journey. That is my motto. So that's why I equip all of my clients with tools and skills for the long game of life and the long game of being on the psychedelic path. So if you want to take advantage of my springtime offer and get $500, guys, that's a big chunk of change. $500 off of my coaching program. Click the link in the show notes or head to modernpsychedelics.net/apply. I cannot wait to connect with you. That's modernpsychedelics.net/apply. All right, let's get back to this episode. Hello, welcome everyone. It's good to have you here. If you are brand new and tuning into the Modern Psychedelics podcast for this first time because you came across the fabulous Dr. Rick Strassman, welcome. It's so nice to have you here. There are over 80 episodes for you to explore, which really document my own healing and transformation journey with psychedelics, as well as my journey of learning more about psychedelics through some of the incredible guest interviews. Before we get into today's episode, I would like to announce the winners of the community feedback form contest. So a couple of months ago, I asked the listeners, you guys, to provide some feedback on the Modern Psychedelics podcast so that I can better serve you. And I did say that 2 people would be winning a coaching session with me. So congratulations to Elsa and Monica. You have both been notified via email and are invited to book a coaching call with me. If you are listening and you would like to have your say and give me some feedback about the show, what you like, what you don't like, what you want more of or less of, go ahead and check out the community feedback form link in the show notes. I really appreciate hearing from you guys. Let's get into today's guest, Dr. Rick Strassman. He does not need much of an introduction. He's kind of a big deal in the world of psychedelia, but born and raised in Southern California, he has a Stanford University Bachelor's of Science in Biology, an MD from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, psychiatry residency training at UC Davis, and psychopharmacology research fellowship at UC San Diego. He discovered the first role of melatonin in humans in the 1980s and began the first new human research with psychedelics in the US in 1990, studying DMT and psilocybin. He is the author of the best-selling book describing the studies, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. He is also the author of the more recent book, The Psychedelic Handbook. He is currently the adjacent associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. Dr. Rick Strassman, as I said, he wrote the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And after I read this book, I knew I had to reach out to him and interview him. DMT is a drug that I have not yet dove into on the podcast. And there's literally no one better on the planet to bring this medicine to you guys than Dr. Rick Strassman. I personally have not had a full breakthrough experience with DMT, although I am very familiar with micro and medium recreational doses of it. So this episode was really such an informative one for myself. We talked about what drew Dr. Strassman to study DMT, and he outlined the studies that he did that took place in the 1990s, also outlined in his book. We cover what a typical DMT experience is like and the differences between nn-DMT, which is the drug that we are talking about today, and 5-MeO-DMT. They're often confused, but are very different. Very, very different. We also talked about what we know about endogenous DMT in the brain, the mysterious role of endogenous DMT in the brain, what current studies are looking at around DMT as a therapeutic, who DMT might be for. We talk about the recreational use of DMT and Rick's first DMT experience with the infamous Terence McKenna. This is a really great episode. In the first half of the episode, we really cover a lot of the scientific research and what we do know about DMT. And the second half is a little more fun, a little more light, where we get more into our own experiences, the recreational uses, and talk about how to integrate DMT experiences. So I hope that you enjoy this episode. Stay tuned until the end because I announce a giveaway for Dr. Rick Strassman's new book, The Psychedelic Handbook. So at the end of this episode, you will hear how you can enter this giveaway, which will also be linked in the show notes. I'll see you guys on the other side. Dr. Rick Strassman, welcome to the podcast. It's so amazing to have you here today with us, sharing.
Thanks, Lana. My pleasure.
Yeah, really looking forward to introducing the audience to a new psychedelic that we have not spent much time on, and you are probably the best person on the planet to talk to about this. So yeah, we really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, it's a bit surprising, isn't it, that more people aren't talking about DMT?
Yeah, I myself haven't had a high dose experience with it. So reading your book was, I think it might have deterred me from it, to be honest. It sounds
good.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Terence McKenna, who was a big spokesman for the DMT experience, used to say that one's hand always shakes lighting the pipe. And no matter how experienced you are, first time, the 100th time, you're never quite sure what's in store for you.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. I just got back from a 5-MeO-DMT experience, and that was wild, but DMT still sounds a little scary to me. So yeah, let's get into it. Not that you need much introduction, but can you please introduce yourself and your work to our listeners?
Sure, yeah. My name is Rick Strassman. I'm a psychiatrist by training. Born and raised in LA, went to school at Pomona College and Stanford University, where I studied biology. Went to medical school in New York, Albert Einstein College of Medicine. returned to California for my training in general psychiatry. Spent a year in Alaska. The pineal gland and winter depression and melatonin were just becoming of interest at that point, which was my stepping stone into doing clinical research because of my interest in the biology of spirituality. Took some extra training at UC San Diego in psychopharmacology research, and then moved out to New Mexico in the mid-1980s, ran the melatonin study, the DMT studies, some psilocybin research, then wrapped things up in 95, then practiced psychiatry for the next 13 years in both the community, mental health environment, and in private practice. Stopped seeing patients in 2008, and I've been writing full-time since then. I'm currently on the adjunct faculty at the University of New Mexico's medical school in the psychiatry department, and I live out in the bush in western New Mexico.
You are a true researcher, and it's pretty rare that I get to speak to someone so deep in the psychedelic research world for so long. So yeah, again, just really grateful that you're spending some time with us today. I want to spend some time talking about your book and the trials, DMT, the spirit molecule, which it was over 20 years ago at this point. So late 80s, early 90s, not much psychedelic research was going on. The doors were still locked. And you wanted to study DMT, which there was not many people doing, not many people even knew about. So what was it about this molecule that really, drew you in?
A couple of things. One of them was me search is research, or research is me search. I had my own psychedelic experiences as a youngster, late teens, early 20s, and I was really impressed. I thought, whoa, this is interesting. And I started off as a chemistry major in college because of my interest in fireworks and bombs, actually. I went to college hoping to start my own line of fireworks or else go into explosives. But people discouraged me and whatnot, so I became a doctor instead. I was impressed with the psychedelic experience and formulated it as change in brain chemistry. There must be some chemical changes in the brain responsible for these highly altered states. And being in California in the late 1960s, early 1970s, besides psychedelics coming in to the West Coast, the East Coast too, but especially the West Coast, Buddhism and Eastern meditation practices were also coming into vogue, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. And the descriptions of the effects of certain kinds of meditation, they seem to overlap with certain aspects of the psychedelic drug experience. I formulated or started speculating about a common biological denominator that was activated both from taking psychedelics and from certain meditation techniques, at least to the extent that the syndromes overlap visions and voices and extreme emotions, insights and meaningfulness, those kinds of things. I went to medical school with that kind of an idea. That's what I wanted to study. But obviously, medical school is gross anatomy and biochemistry and infectious diseases and things. So when the reality hit me, I dropped out actually because of some depression before the first year was up. I ended up at a Zen monastery, actually, was thinking I'd become a monk. But then my depression improved and I went back to school. And I kept my interest to myself. First things first, you have to be a physician if you're going to be doing research with psychedelics. And especially during that time, this was the early 70s, the mid 70s, and the Controlled Substances Act had just been passed a few years before. Psychedelics had begun as a wonder drug or a class of wonder drug like the SSRIs back in the 80s, and deja vu all over again with psychedelics being touted as wonder drugs again. But they became horror drugs in the late 60s, early 70s, all the overdoses and suicides and hospitalizations and all kinds of problems. So then once they became outlawed, or because their availability for research became incredibly restricted, people just forgot about them. They just became zero drugs. Nobody knew about psychedelics. There were still underground things going on. But academically researched, there just wasn't anything happening at all. So I was interested in the biology of spiritual experience, as I mentioned earlier, but also any kind of altered state which occurred without drugs. Meditation effects, dreams, near-death experiences, even psychosis, which is a highly altered state. And I began looking at the pineal gland, which has a venerable history in esoteric physiology, the Hindu chakras and the Kabbalistic Sephirot and those things. The location of the pineal gland in the middle of the top of the head corresponds to the location of the subjective experience of the highest altered states resulting from prayer or from meditation. And there was not much known about the human physiology of melatonin back then. There were even some suggestions that it was quite mind-altering, caused REM sleep, stimulated the dream state, made depressed patients more depressed, was even psychedelic. So I began looking for what I guess you would call a spirit molecule, a naturally occurring compound, which potentially, when elevated, would induce spiritual or altered states of consciousness. We looked at melatonin, and I was hoping if melatonin were psychedelic, it would be game over. This is very simple. The pineal glands in everybody, melatonin is produced at night during dreams and things. But we discovered that melatonin was only sedating. So it's back to the drawing board. And in the meantime, I learned about DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is chemically related to melatonin. It's a tryptamine like melatonin is, and like serotonin is. It's produced naturally in the body, in the human body. And it's quite psychedelic. It had been studied previously in Europe and in the US and could be given safely to people. So I faced the obstacles which were associated with no human research occurring in the US since the Controlled Substances Act, almost 20 years. I started working on getting permission, funding the drug, all that, in September 1988. And it was really Kafkaesque. It was just an enormous number of hurdles, all bureaucratic. And 2 years later, or actually 2 years plus 2 months later, we gave our first dose of DMT in November 1990. Yeah, and I was interested in comparing the effects of DMT with the descriptions of non-drug altered states like dreams, meditation, near-death experiences. And to the extent that they overlapped, I could then argue for a potential role of endogenous DMT in producing those non-drug states. So in some ways they did, some ways they didn't. And we ran a couple of more studies other than just giving various doses of DMT to our volunteers. We started some psilocybin work as well. Yeah, so I closed up shop after 5 years. I wasn't able to accumulate a team around me back then in Albuquerque. Our work was so cutting edge and so far out and so weird that nobody really knew what we were doing. And they figured, what could I contribute? Or that's what they were saying. Or they didn't want to move, or they thought Albuquerque was too small fry or whatever. So it was mostly mission accomplished. We gave a lot of DMT. We established a protocol with the DEA and FDA to give humans this Schedule I psychedelics. And I was not able to branch out into psychotherapy research, spirituality research, creativity research, those kind of more interesting things, other than the pure psychopharmacology. But other groups have picked up the ball since then.
Yeah, you outline in your book how many hurdles you had to go through and twists and turns, even after you got the permissions to do the study, right? There was a lot of surprises during these trials for you.
Yeah, I just, was pulling my hair out. Yeah. Yeah, some people think, it was the hostility of the government or their being that they were antagonistic, or they didn't want to see the research done. But that wasn't the case at all. They were very keen on the research being done. I received 2 grants even before I got my hands on the drug. So there was a lot of interest in this and the studies taking place. It was more just bureaucratic. Like how do you possess a Schedule 1 drug for human use if it's not approved for human use? And how can you get approval for human use if you don't have the drug? So that was the catch-22, which I had to maneuver through over the space of a couple of years. Yeah, I got funding, for 2, grants, from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which are extraordinarily, competitive. And I got both grants on the first submission. They didn't even require any modification of the grants. So I think that bespeaks 2 things. One is the whole myth of the government not wanting to support research is a myth. If you can design a rigorous study and defend why you want to do what you want to do, there's money there. And the other is the government was very interested in studying these drugs after a 20-year hiatus.
So there was bureaucratic hurdles, and it also seems like there was hurdles around just the phenomenology of DMT and what was coming up. It seems like that really surprised you when you were doing the research.
What do you mean, the experiences themselves?
Yes, of the volunteers.
Yeah, so we only studied experienced psychedelic users. And this was back in the early 90s, and people didn't really know that much about DMT. Terence was talking about it, but still it was a fairly obscure drug. And we studied 54 people, I think, and only maybe 2 or 3 had previously used DMT recreationally. But everybody else had taken mushrooms or LSD, peyote, mescaline, those kinds of things. And we chose experienced volunteers for a couple of reasons. One was that they would be familiar with the experience and would be able to compare and contrast the DMT effect with, for example, the effects of LSD. And they would be familiar with how strange a full psychedelic experience is, and they would be less likely to panic and would be able to manage any tight corners that they found themselves in. Yeah, my expectation of the experiences, at least from the spirituality point of view, were predicated on my having been studying and practicing Zen Buddhism for 15 to 20 years before that. And the paradigmatic spiritual experience in Zen Buddhism is what's called Kensho or Satori, an enlightenment experience. And it's free of content. There's no, there isn't any self, there's no time, there's no space, there's no words, there's no feeling, there's no body. It's what's called emptiness, although it's a very pregnant with potential emptiness, but still is empty of any recognizable form or content. And most of my volunteers were also meditators and were expecting that kind of experience as well. But lo and behold, only one of the volunteers had that kind of experience, and he was somebody with a long-standing interest in that kind of experience, was a member of a religious organization which cultivated that kind of experience, valued it. And he was a religious studies major in college. So only one individual had what I've later defined as the mystical unitive state, where there isn't any self, there's no content, the Kensho kind of experience. Everybody else had experiences full of content with which they related and interacted with. So that led me to define a different kind of psychedelic or highly altered state, which I've labeled the interactive relational, where your personality is maintained. There's plenty of content in that state with which you interact. The state itself, if you give IV DMT or you smoke a big dose of DMT, it works very quickly within a few heartbeats. You experience a huge rush of inner acceleration, inner tension. magnification of everything. The room starts pixelating and quickly dissolves. And you should close your eyes in order to focus on what's going on in there. Yeah, and you're transported out of your body. You lose awareness of your body, and you enter into a world of light, which is full of rapidly moving, morphing things, colorful, and depending on the ability of the volunteer to maneuver in that state, you can extract certain kinds of information from that experience. The peak effect, though, occurs within a couple, 3 minutes or so, and then you start coming down at around 5 minutes. It was a bit difficult for the volunteers to stabilize themselves in that state and be able to work with it in a more leisurely manner. It's like you were just thrust into that world. There's a limited amount of time to make the most of it, and then you start coming down. So you're pretty normal within a half hour. You're stunned, slack-jawed as it were, after a high dose. But the temporal sequence is that after 30 minutes or so, you're pretty much down. You're able to drink tea and converse and start filling out rating scales.
Yeah, so it sounds like you said only one of your volunteers had that kind of complete unitive oneness, non-dual experience.
Right.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't expect that from DMT. I would love to actually get your perspective on this. I've heard the difference between nn-DMT and 5-MeO-DMT described as, obviously DMT is the spirit molecule. It is like the spirit worlds, the spirit realms, familiar content, as you were talking about, whereas 5-MeO kind of bypasses all of that and goes straight to the oneness, the unity, the non-dual experience. But I've also heard that it is potentially possible to reach that experience with a high enough dose of nn-DMT. So yeah, just curious to hear about your perspective of the differences and similarities between the two.
Yeah, you don't hear stories of unitive white light, ego burnout, nuclear explosion kind of stuff with DMT. It's much more common with 5-methoxy-DMT. The chemistry is different, the pharmacology almost different. Oh, there was just a paper a few weeks ago came out looking more carefully at the animal physiology of 5-MeO. And you hear a lot of stories about people just checking out on 5-MeO. They don't remember what happened. They flop around.
Yeah, the whiteout.
Yeah, they're just completely whited out. Yeah. So this paper actually described that 5-MeO causes epileptiform electrical activity in the animal brain. So it could be the amnesia and the flopping around and the complete whiteout is a minor seizure. There's a lot of interest in 5-MeO as a therapeutic drug, but it's a lot to handle even without the knowledge that it may induce seizures. But now I think people are going to be thinking twice about touting the therapeutic efficacy of 5-MeO. The authors of that paper tried to salvage some therapeutic potential benefit by referring to the beneficial effect of electroconvulsive therapy in depression, which is true. If you have a really depressed person who's not responding to anything, you give them ECT and they often respond. When I was a resident and junior faculty, I gave a lot of ECT and it's a miraculous cure. So they were saying in this paper, there's ECT, and that's really useful, but you don't begin treating depression with ECT. It's your last resort. So the notion that, we should continue looking at 5-MeO because it's ECT, I don't think is a very strong argument in its favor. Yeah, but getting back to the comparison, DMT generally is more visual, your sense of self is maintained. You may be even stronger than usual. The hallmark of both of those compounds, I think, is the feeling that what you're undergoing or witnessing or apprehending is more real than real, which is a unique element of the DMT experience. The 5-MeO one, but obviously I'm more familiar with DMT. And so that is an interesting aspect of the drug effect.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I want to spend some time talking about endogenous DMT in the human body. So when you wrote the book, in comparison to now, what have we learned about that? Has science explored DMT production in the pineal gland? What do we know about that?
Well, the brain makes DMT. Mm-hmm. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. The pineal gland may or may not. I think the jury is still out. Surprisingly, we know more, but the amount of data and the amount of effort expended in understanding naturally occurring DMT is shockingly thin. So DMT was discovered in psychedelic Amazonian plants in the 1940s. And it was first studied in humans in the 1950s. In Budapest, Stephen Zara, there was a Hungarian psychiatrist who was interested in studying LSD, but he couldn't because it was behind the Iron Curtain. And so he went back to the library, saw, there's this DMT in plants. Let me try that. Yeah, so he synthesized a batch and discovered it was not orally active. It had to be administered parenterally, intramuscularly back then. And it was quite psychoactive if it were injected. But it remained an obscure compound for the next 10 years or so until it was discovered in the tissues of animals, mammals, in blood, urine, and spinal fluid. And then a year or two after that, in the mid-1960s, it was also discovered in human body fluids. So everybody was keen on understanding the function of endogenous DMT. The focus back then was more on its potential role in schizophrenia. Perhaps schizophrenics produced too much DMT, and that was the reason that they had hallucinations, for example. So there was a lot of effort expended in that avenue. There wasn't any interest in understanding its potential role in non-psychotic altered states like dreams or meditation, more schizophrenia. This was the beginning of the modern age of psychopharmacology, and Thorazine was just discovered and being used. The earliest antidepressants were discovered and being used. So the focus on brain chemistry and psychopharmacology was purely oriented towards understanding mental illness and helping treat mental illness. So there were quite a few studies done, for example, comparing levels of DMT in schizophrenics compared to normal volunteers, comparing responsiveness to injections of DMT in schizophrenics versus normal volunteers. And those studies were just getting off the ground when the passage of the Controlled Substances Act took place and all clinical research shut down. And since then, since 1970 or so, there has not been a lot of research into endogenous DMT. The going theory back then was that it was produced in the lung. And this was based on rabbit lung studies where you homogenized or blended a rabbit lung in a blender and added the ingredients to make DMT, and voila, there was DMT. There was a lot of interest in the lung as a potential source of DMT. And back then also, there was some Japanese data indicating that DMT is actively transported into the brain using an energy-dependent mechanism, which is only the case with compounds that the brain requires for normal metabolism, blood sugar, for example. It's transported into the brain using an energy-dependent process. That was also the case with DMT. So the theory was that it's produced in the lung and then it's transported into the brain in everyday life. And perhaps it was more active in psychosis, let's say. But then there were some studies in the late 1990s or early 2000s indicating that the intact lung did not make DMT. And this was because you need both enzymes which synthesize DMT in the same cell. There's two enzymes required for the synthesis, but they ended up occurring in two different cells in the lung. And when you looked at whole lung as opposed to lung homogenate, there wasn't any DMT made in the lung. There were also some brain studies by the same group, Michael Thompson at the Mayo in Minnesota, indicating that DMT wasn't made in the brain either of mammals. But his method wasn't quite as sensitive or as specific as it could be, looking for the enzymes which were necessary to make DMT in the brain. And there wasn't any in the pineal gland either, using his methodologies. But a few years after that, there was a group in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the university there, a pharmacologist named Jimo Borjigan, who stumbled upon the Spirit Molecule book 13 years after it came out. And she became and her field of study was melatonin and the pineal gland. And she had never heard of DMT. And she gave me a call and we talked. And she said, I'm going to look for DMT in the pineal gland. So she did. And John Dean and she published a paper in 2013 demonstrating DMT in the fluid that was around the pineal gland in the living rodent. So that seemed to confirm that the pineal gland makes DMT. But they continued looking more closely and they published a paper. There were two interesting findings from that 2019 paper. One is if you look more carefully at the pineal gland, it does not seem to make DMT. And so they concluded that their earlier findings were the result of the probe snagging on your brain tissue on the way into and out of the pineal gland. So that is part two, is that the brain makes DMT. That was their major finding, that the brain makes DMT and the pineal gland DMT, which they reported earlier, was actually brain DMT. They discovered in the brain that the two necessary enzymes were co-localized in the same neurons. So that was key in demonstrating that the brain could make its own DMT. You don't need the lung. You don't need active transport using an energy-dependent mechanism. That the brain makes DMT because certain neurons contain both of the necessary enzymes. So even more interesting was that concentrations of brain DMT are comparable to concentrations of established neurotransmitters like serotonin and like dopamine. So that raises the possibility of a DMT neurotransmitter system in the mammalian brain, which is a very weird thing to think about. And the other is that levels of brain DMT increase in the dying brain. If you experimentally give a heart attack to an animal, concentrations of DMT increase dramatically, especially in the visual cortex, 5 times the normal values, maybe even 10 times normal values. So that suggests that there is a link, at least, between elevated levels of DMT in visual cortex in the dying animal, which points to a possible role of naturally occurring DMT mediating the visual effects of the NDE, for example. But these are incredibly important questions. What is DMT doing in the brain? It's this incredibly weird psychedelic. There's one person in La Jolla, John Dean, who did the 2013 and 2019 papers in Jimo's lab. He's at UC San Diego looking to visualize synthesis of DMT in the living human brain using high-tech imaging techniques. And there was one grad student who recently graduated from Jimo's lab looking at endogenous DMT synthesis. So there's 2 people in the world looking at endogenous DMT right now. And one just graduated. And he's on a leave. He's taking a break. He's working in his pottery studio. So strictly speaking, there's one person in the world looking at endogenous DMT, which seems to me to be major oversight in the scientific stream of things.
Yeah. At least there's one.
At least there's one.
That probably makes you pretty happy that there's at least one person looking into it.
Look at all the people giving psilocybin for depression.
Right.
And there's one guy in the world looking at endogenous DMT, which what the heck is it doing in the human brain? Is it mediating our perceptual world? Is it mediating our sense of reality? Is it elevated when you dream? Is it elevated in psychosis? Is it elevated when you meditate?
Let me introduce you to Kanna, a legal, well-researched plant medicine from South Africa. It's an empathogen, which means it promotes feelings of empathy, openness, and connection. Through this state, we can experience profound emotional shifts and breakthroughs that make a big difference in our day. Through research, it has been found that Kanna has an extremely low risk profile. In fact, one of its active alkaloids has been studied and is prescribed as a pharmaceutical for anxiety and depression. Rather than being a huge experience you have to set aside a lot of time, energy, and money for, Kanna is that gentle daily ally for uplifting mood. Kanna can be used as a daily supplement or even in a microdosing protocol. Kanna Extract Co. creates the world's most potent and effective Kanna extracts. With third-party lab testing, you know that what you're getting is the active alkaloids that will actually make a difference in your day. If you want to learn more about this plant medicine, check out episode 74 with Brian Luttrell, Kanna Extract Co.'s founder. Have I mentioned that it's legal and therefore accessible in the US? Get yours today by visiting kannaextract.com and use Lana at checkout to save 10%. That's Kanna Extract, KANNA.com, and use Lana, LANA, at checkout to save 10%. All right, back to the episode.
What's the role of endogenous DMT in mammals? Yeah, it's a strange thing. One could speculate as to why it's being ignored as erratically as it is. It's also mostly being ignored even within the therapeutic arena. There was one study from Yale came out a year or two ago giving one high dose of DMT to depressives. They improved. There's some research, commercial research in England. Small pharma has got a new version of DMT, and they're looking at it for depression as well. And one of the more interesting themes or projects which have come up the last a couple of years with respect to research into DMT is the continuous infusion protocol. We established that you don't develop tolerance to closely spaced repeated doses of DMT. If you take LSD every day for a few days, you mostly stop responding. And that's the case with psilocybin and your mescaline as well. That's called tolerance. You stop responding normally or in this to the same magnitude after repeated dosing of the drug at the same dose. And that hadn't been established with DMT. And even giving it every half hour, there's no tolerance to the psychological effects anyway. But that's spurred a colleague of mine, Andrew Gallimore, to contact me a few years later. And we wrote a paper on a continuous infusion model of DMT. Like if you just infused it over the space of a half hour or an hour or whatnot, would you be able to stay in that state? So there are two groups doing that now. There's one in England and one in Switzerland. And the one in England, I think, extended it for half hour, continuous infusion for a half hour, as opposed to the way that I was giving it, which was just injected over the space of a minute and then just let her rip. The Swiss group has been extending the experience out to 90 minutes. So that mostly at this point is to help understand the phenomenology of the state in a more leisurely manner. But I think it also has got some therapeutic potential as well, because you can turn up the infusion rate or you could turn down the infusion rate, which would increase or decrease the intensity of the experience almost in real time. So if you're doing your psychotherapy with somebody and they want to go deeper, you can increase the infusion rate. If they want to come down and talk about things with you, you can lower the infusion rate or even stop it, and you could interact with your therapist. Or if you want to maintain things at a medium rate, you could do that as well. That hasn't been employed yet in those protocols, but I think it's only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm. It would be interesting to see who would choose DMT or who would be a good candidate for DMT for depression. over something like psilocybin or ayahuasca or even LSD, which really, for me, leads me to the question of, other than psychonauts who are really interested in exploring inner space and other dimensions and fearless about that, who is DMT for?
Who is DMT for? If you're interested in the psychedelic experience, for your curiosity, for example, who's it for? So I suppose that question is, what's the role of your psychedelics within society? Yeah, therapeutically, psychedelics seem to have potential in the right setting. You just don't take mushrooms if you're depressed and hope to feel better, like that airline pilot, for example. Yeah, that's not the way to do it. You want to do it in a supervised setting. You're screened carefully. You're prepared. You're supervised. You're followed up. You're treated if you have problems. But in the controlled research environment, your psychedelics have got a role to play in therapeutic endeavors. Creativity, there's some old research and a lot of anecdotal reports that psychedelics increase creativity. Understanding the mind, how does the mind work? What's the relationship between the mind and the brain? Recreation, most people trip for fun, I would say. I was at an event a number of years ago with Alex Gray, the artist, the visionary artist, and we were talking about, what do you call these drugs? Are they psychedelics? Are they entheogens? Are they psychotomimetics? What are they exactly? And he was like voting for entheogens, like they're holy, they're sacred, they're special. And we were walking past the dance hall, and there are hundreds of kids that were tripping on drugs, dancing and screaming and taking off their clothes. And I turned to Alex and I said, entheogens? So I would say most people trip for fun. And there isn't any harm in having fun, but you have to be careful.
I don't know how much fun the doses you were giving your volunteers would be at a rave.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah. Like any psychedelic experience is the end result of three factors: the set and the setting and the dose.
Yeah.
So you can microdose and you clean house more quickly, or you could code, more creatively. You could take medium doses and walk around. You could take high doses and just lay down. There's a lot of interest in these compounds for their so-called spiritual effects, but I think in a way that's troubling, because you just don't become a spiritual person after you trip with that intent. It's set and setting. Charles Manson took a lot of LSD, gave a lot of LSD, and developed a cadre of serial killers. So LSD or any psychedelic, you've got the set, who you are, what you want to get out of the experience, the setting, who you're doing it with, and the dose, small, medium, and large. So the spiritual effects, like if you're a spiritually oriented person and you want to get some answers to your spiritual questions, then your psychedelics can be helpful. It just depends. Specifically for DMT, it's an extreme experience. It can establish a benchmark for psychedelic intensity. But it isn't for everyone. 5-methoxy DMT, for example, is just so mind-blowing that there are a lot of flashbacks which occur afterwards. So you don't want to begin your psychedelic work with an overdose, with a psychic overdose even though it may not be a pharmacological overdose, it's still a psychological overdose. That isn't the case with DMT to anywhere near the extent. Yeah, so I guess different drugs for different settings and sets. The advantage of DMTs is quite short. And that's another reason that we chose it to study for my research, is even if it was a bad experience, it would be short. But once you take LSD or psilocybin, you're occupied for the next 6 or 8 or 12 hours. And so there is an advantage of the shorter duration if you just want a short experience. It used to be called the businessman's trip back in the 60s. Theoretically, you could smoke a DMT on your lunch break and then go back to work. It depends. You don't prescribe the same antibiotic for all infections. You don't prescribe the same antidepressant for all cases of depression. So you tailor the drug for the effect that you're looking for.
Yeah, I love I guess the micro doses of DMT. That's all I've ever experienced with the pens that you can get online now anywhere.
DMT vape pens, isn't that
Yeah.
something? Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think
Yeah.
of those?
User beware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't really have a breakthrough experience with them. You'd have to
You can.
smoke,
If
right?
it's a potent enough preparation and you take enough
Yeah.
in, you can have a breakthrough experience. But you can't puff like a bit here and there. Terence used to joke about his definition of drug abuse. It was taking too little was drug abuse in his mind. And in a way, our small doses, our in-between sorts of doses in my studies were not experienced in a particularly pleasant manner. You felt the excitation without any breakthrough. So you're kind of betwixt and between. And people didn't really like the smaller doses uniformly. So what happened to you with your microdosing, like a small puff or whatever kind of puff on the vape pen?
Yeah, so I'm usually doing it at parties where I'm on a cocktail of substances, but what it does is it just adds this beautiful sharpness to the air and kind of just heightens my sense of feeling connected. And then often it actually makes me feel a little tired and reminds me of that state of waking dreams within an ayahuasca ceremony. I think that my addition of DMT to my regular roster of my rave cocktail has helped me to go, maybe it's not helped me, but has caused me to go much deeper on the dance floor than I normally would. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting. Well, Spangle, the group Spangle. I suppose if you were to categorize their genre, it would be EDM, like electronic dance music. So I was at an event in Texas a number of years ago with Spangle, and I smelled more DMT coming from the dance floor than I smelled marijuana. And I asked Simon about that, and I said, man, there's a lot of DMT coming up from the dance floor. Is that common? And he said, at my concerts, there's more DMT smell than cannabis. And some kid came up to me and he said, I just took a small dose of DMT. It was great. I'm going to take a big dose in the next 10 minutes. It's like this huge rave scene. And like this kid went to the corner with his friends, tucked away in the corner, but still. Yeah, and he had a huge DMT experience and he came up to me and said it was amazing and all that. But it seemed a little reckless.
Yeah, it can really merge you with the music, though. Like the experience that I had was I became the music, basically, with the DMT. It was really beautiful. But yeah, as you were saying, it can get reckless.
Well, I think with small doses, small doses you can still maneuver. But if you take a full dose and you can't move,
Yeah.
and you're completely out of your body and it's just chaos. Like after that event, I was at some friends that were hosting me, and they said, "Oh, you want to be around when this guy smokes DMT for the first time?" And I said, "Sure." Yeah. So I went over to their house, and set and setting, they were calling for pizza on the phone, and they were giving this guy DMT, and he slides off the couch and he goes outside and starts screaming in the middle of the backyard in Dallas in the middle of the day. And I thought, set and setting, you really need to be careful with your high doses of anything, but especially DMT.
Yeah, included in that setting would be the guides, the people that you are around. I can't imagine doing something like a high dose of DMT or 5-MeO casually. It's just
the first time I smoked DMT, Terence gave it to me. We were sitting on a bed. He just sat and described what to do and how to react. And some friends were on a couch up against the wall. You're praying and you're meditating and all that. So it was a great DMT experience. But like in a crowded living room with people calling for pizza on the phone and all kinds of chaos breaking out.
Yeah.
It isn't the worst possible, but it certainly could have been prepared a bit better.
Yeah. Well, it's very special that you were baptized into DMT by Terence McKenna. That's amazing. Very special.
Yeah, it was very cool. Yeah. It convinced me that I was going to study DMT. Like I was still petering out with the melatonin research. It didn't quite pan out. So I was wondering what to do. I learned about DMT. I was speculating about the pineal and mystical states and near-death states in DMT. Yeah, and I gave a talk at a meeting once that Terence was there. He said, "They were talking about DMT. You want to try it?" So I tried it, and then
Yeah.
the next day, I withdrew my melatonin grant application and started working on the DMT one
Wow.
within a few months.
Me search, like you said at the beginning.
Research is me search, oftentimes, yeah, especially when
I
it
love
comes to
that.
drugs.
I want to start winding this down. The phenomenology of DMT is quite intense and unique, right? It's pretty common to experience leaving the body, the consciousness leaving the body, encounters with entities and beings, traveling to different dimensions, alien abductions, right? People are reporting these types of experiences. What do you know about how people integrate and make sense of and bring back these out of this world experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's obviously a good question. I think integration begins way before you trip. One of my mentors was a Jungian psychologist named Leo. This was in the 80s, and I was interested in being supervised by him for psychedelic sessions. I think we were going to do ibogaine the first time. Yeah, it was ibogaine. I went out there to Berkeley, and we started talking, and he said, "The trip has already begun," which was interesting. And it was true, because once you start thinking about tripping, it's in your mind. And you're wondering, what's it going to be like? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? What do I work on? How do I get ready? What do I want out of it? What don't I want out of it? So the integration part, I think, also begins when you start to think about tripping. How do you want to apply whatever it is that you experience? The most common example, it might be for spiritual purposes. Let's say you want to develop your meditation practice or your prayer practice, your yoga practice. You would want to be working on those things before you trip. You would want to start looking at, where am I happy with my practice? Where am I not? What do I want in terms of it evolving and growing? What are the questions which I've got regarding my practice? So you would already be getting ready for integrating. You would be looking at those questions when you're in the altered state. And hopefully you'd be writing things down or dictating, or the person in the room with you would be taking notes and would be remembering things for you. You could discuss things with them. And then you work on those things once you're down. I've really only had one major DMT experience, and it was 1985 or 1986. But in a way, I've been integrating that experience ever since, so like for the next 36 years or so, 37 years. And one of the generic pieces of advice I give people about integrating is to occupy yourself with things that evoke in you the same feelings that were the most valuable when you were tripping. For example, for whatever reason, I discovered I love the Hebrew Bible, and I love the Hebrew language, and I love the message contained in the Hebrew Bible. It reminds me of the feelings of certainty and expansiveness and meaningfulness and mysteriousness, which have been the most valuable aspects of my psychedelic experiences. One of the hallmarks of any psychedelic experience, including DMT, is that sense of meaningfulness, the convincingly true feeling which comes up in association with certain ideas, certain feelings which occur in the psychedelic state. So if you can find things that evoke that same sense of meaningfulness, I think you're on the right track with respect to integrating the most important elements of the psychedelic experience. If it's jarring and it doesn't make any sense, you need to get help. And that could be from any source. Your local friendly cleric, or your therapist, or your best friend, or your spouse, or your teacher, or your mentor. Yeah, that's another thing that I think needs to be addressed more carefully, is the issue of adverse effects to psychedelics. They're being candy coated now by calling them challenging experiences or extended extended difficulties. But I think that's sugar coating. If you're psychotic for 5 years after taking a big dose of LSD in the wrong setting when you are in the wrong state of mind, that's not a challenging experience. That's a chronic, long-term, severe adverse effect. You don't call a skin rash to penicillin a challenging experience, just like you don't call a heart attack in response to cancer chemotherapy a challenging experience. Within biomedical, psychological, realm, there are no challenging experiences. There's adverse effects, or there's acute, which is in the state itself. You might be anxious, you might be paranoid, you might be depressed, or even suicidal, and those pass within minutes or hours. There's your short-term, mid-term, and long-term. There's mild, moderate, and severe adverse effects. If you're experiencing an adverse effect and you don't really tell yourself, and if you're a clinician, you don't tell the person that it's an adverse effect, you label it like, oh, you're anxious, or you're depressed, or you're disorganized, or you're dissociated. And you can tell yourself that too, as opposed to I'm having a challenging experience. That's completely meaningless. And it may prevent you from getting the care you need. So if you're anxious and it's continuing for more than like a day or two afterward, you should pay attention to it. For example, the first time I smoked 5-methoxy-DMT, it completely rattled my cage. It was just really god-awful. But luckily, I was in psychoanalysis at the time, going 4 or 5 days a week, lying on the couch, free associated. So I could talk about it with my analyst. My friends weren't that helpful because their experiences were beatific and what's your problem? Why didn't you have a good experience? Like I was lucky to be in therapy at the time. Yeah, you just can't ignore adverse effects and you can't sugarcoat them. It is true that bad experiences can be utilized, but not automatically. You need to work through those bad experiences, find out what gave rise to them, understand them, work them through, and then do the work involved with not having a recurrence if you are going to take your psychedelics later. There's this notion of getting back on the horse after you've been thrown, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think you need to take care of what came up in your negative way first.
Thank you for saying that about the adverse effects for our listeners who might be experiencing that. So to close this off, you wrote a new book more than 20 years after your bestseller. So the Psychedelic Handbook, a practical guide to psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, MDMA, and DMT. Tell us a little bit about this and what led you to write this book now.
Yeah. So after the first book came out, The Spirit Molecule, I co-authored a book called Inner Paths to Outer Space. It was the brainchild of the second author, who was an oncologist and also a sci-fi buff. The next book I wrote was DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, which was my attempt to contextualize the interactive relational DMT effect within a religious setting. The Buddhism emptiness model, the all is one mystical unitive state, didn't apply to the DMT effect. And so I went back to the drawing board with respect to the religious traditions out there, which prioritized the interactive relational state as opposed to the mystical unitive one. And lo and behold, it was in the Hebrew Bible's notion of the prophetic state. If you read Ezekiel, the first chapter of Ezekiel, it is a big DMT experience. There's spinning wheels and globes, and there's ice, and there's the roaring sound, and there's beings with wings and eyes on their wings, and it's just completely DMT. So scoured the Hebrew Bible for all of the descriptions of any altered state in any person and compared and contrasted those reports with the reports of my DMT volunteers. Yeah, so that was a 16-year project. I retaught myself in biblical Hebrew. I read the Hebrew Bible 5 times in Hebrew and in English. Dozens of commentaries, Maimonides, Spinoza. It was a major effort. Yeah, so that came out in 2014. Once that book came out, I got sick. super sick, almost died twice with really horrible infections, which people here didn't really know what to do with. And I swore if I lived, I was going to write about it. And I did live, and I wrote about it. It's an autobiographical novel, in quotes, air quotes, called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. And it's pretty morbid, but pretty funny. It came out in 2019. Yeah, so I was taking a break, and then Michael Pollan's book came out. And everybody just became interested in psychedelics all of a sudden. But Michael Pollan's book isn't really that great. And Michael Pollan isn't a clinician. He's not a researcher. He's not a psychologist. He's a science reporter. He's a science journalist. As much as anything, I wrote that book to fill in the gaps that Michael's book produced, which was a book about your psychedelics by somebody that's been in the field, has done decades of psychotherapy, went to medical school, became a psychiatrist, practiced and studied Zen, went through psychoanalysis, did psychopharmacology research. I figured I knew what I was talking about, and it would be a good counterweight to the entheogenic crowd out there, which is you take this drug, you have a mystical experience, and the Messianic era is upon us. You don't have to really read between the lines all that much to get the sense of that's the agenda. I wanted to sober up the agenda and talk about adverse effects as much as potentially beneficial ones and provide a more balanced approach.
Amazing. I haven't read that one yet, but I will now that I've finally finished The Spirit Molecule.
Yeah, the Psychedelic Handbook it's what you would call a small textbook, but still, after I've edited my writing enough times, I write in an engaging style. Lots of people describe reading the book in just a couple of days, and they get quite a bit out of it.
Amazing. And we're going to be giving away a copy of the Psychedelic Handbook, which is so much fun. That will be hosted on Instagram. So if you're listening and you want to enter the giveaway, go to Instagram and we'll run it for a week after this episode airs. So thank you, Dr. Rick Strassman, for, giving us a book to give away.
For sure. Yeah. Spread the word.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any last words of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. Be careful. Pay attention to setting, and dose. And good luck, and get help if you need it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the listeners for listening. We'll catch you in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to and supporting the show. To stay in touch, sign up for my mailing list, which can be found in the show notes or on modernpsychedelics.net. If this episode sparked something within, please let me know by leaving a review of the Modern Psychedelics podcast on Apple and Spotify. This really helps to share these messages with those who need them, which is the whole reason why I do what I do. And if you haven't already, come join the ongoing conversation over on Instagram with other beautiful souls. We have an incredible and conscious community over at the handle Modern Psychedelics. And don't forget that the work begins after you come back down to earth. And I'm standing shoulder to shoulder, doing it with you. This episode is produced in collaboration with Film with Integrity. They are a values-forward production studio providing end-to-end production from concept to content. They do event video, documentary series, commercial and marketing videos, and of course, podcast production. If you are working on a project that deserves quality of production and content without sacrificing heart and soul, visit filmwithintegrity.com to check out their beautiful work and get in touch with their team.